To the Americans, the M4 Sherman was a triumph of mass production. To the British, it was a reliable if workhorse, but to the German, dug into the hedge of Normandy and the dikes of the Sherman became something else entirely when it bore the Canadian maple leaf. Relentless, terrifying anomaly, there is a reason why hardened SS Panzer commanders who often dismissed the Sherman as a lighter that burned. At the first hit began to specifically dread sectors held by the Canadian First Army. It wasn't because the Canadians had better tanks, it was because they used them with a level of aggression and improvisation that German doctrine simply couldn't process, from welding spare tracks and pouring concrete onto their hulls to increase survival to using tank squadrons as indirect artillery to erase entire grid squares. The Canadians didn't just operate the Sherman, they weaponized it in ways that were technically forbidden and tactically unhinged. This is the story of how a mediocre tank became a legend of terror in the hands of an army that refused to play by the rules. February 1944, the damp staging grounds of southern England. The invasion of Europe was looming, and the Canadian Armoured Corps was in the midst of a massive logistical transition. For years, Canadian industry had produced the Ram tank, a homegrown variant that was mechanically sound but armed with a gun that was already obsolete, now facing the reality of a standardized Allied supply chain. Thousands of Canadian tankers were told to leave their Rams behind and climb into the hulls of M4 Shermans. To the strategic planners in London and Washington, the M4 Sherman was a masterpiece of industrial warfare. It was reliable, easily, and light enough to cross most European bridges. It possessed a 75 gun that could fire an excellent high explosive shell perfect for blasting infantry and soft fortifications, but to the crews who inspected them in the muddy depot of Sussex, the tool left much to be desired. It was tall, creating a silhouette that was impossible to hide in the flat terrain of Normandy. Its vertical side armor was insufficient against the high-velocity anti-tank guns the Germans had been perfecting on the Eastern Front, and perhaps most concerning to the men inside, it had a reputation for catastrophic ammunition fires when penetrated. The Sherman was designed for a doctrine of exploitation, breaking through enemy lines and racing into the rear. It was a tool built for speed and reliability, not for slugging it out toe-to-toe with heavy German armor, however the user in this equation. The Canadian soldier had no intention of using the tank strictly according to the manual. The Canadian army that arrived in Normandy was distinct from its British and American counterparts. They were an volunteer force drawn from a young nation that had come of age in the trenches of the First World War. Institutional memory of the Canadian Corps was one of shock troops, men who were thrown into the meat grinder to break the unbreakable lines. This cultural DNA transferred directly into their armored doctrine. While the British often emphasized caution to conserve manpower, and the Americans relied on overwhelming logistical superiority, the Canadians developed a mindset of pragmatic, ruthless aggression. They understood early on that the war would not be won by preserving their machines, but by destroying the enemy's will to fight regardless of the cost. When these men took the controls of the M4 Sherman, a friction occurred between the machine's design and the crew's intent. Sherman was not built to be a battering ram, yet that is exactly how the Canadians intended to use it. They recognized the tank's limitations immediately, but rather than letting those limitations dictate a cautious approach, they inverted the logic. If the armor couldn't stop a German 88 shell, then there was no point in moving slowly or hiding. The only defense was an overwhelming offense. This is where the German perception of the unhinged Canadian tanker began to form. German tactical manuals emphasized the preservation of heavy assets like the Tiger and Panther, using them as snipers from long range. They expected Allied tanks to behave rationally, to retreat when, to flank when blocked, and to call for air support when facing superior armor. The Canadians, however, often refused to disengage. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division, who would face the Canadians directly in the carnage of Caen, noted a disturbing tenacity. When a Canadian Sherman column encountered heavy resistance, they didn't just maneuver, they saturated the target. The Canadians exploited the Sherman's one true advantage: its rate of fire and mechanical endurance. A German Tiger might destroy 2 Shermans, but the Canadians would send 4 more, firing white phosphorus to blind the heavy cat, followed by high explosives to strip away its infantry support, and finally armor-piercing rounds aimed at Tracks and viewports, the Canadian philosophy was that the tank was expendable, the objective was not. This created a battlefield dynamic where the inferior tool was wielded with such ferocity that it negated the technical superiority of the German engineering. The German crews, disciplined and methodical, found themselves unnerved by an enemy that treated a tank battle less like a duel and more like a chaotic brawl. Furthermore, the Canadians were highly mechanized before they even reached the front, because they had spent years training on the ram tank. England, the drivers and mechanics knew the radial engines and suspension systems inside out. They could push the Sherman to its mechanical breaking point and keep it running. This allowed Canadian armored columns to maintain tempo of operations that exhausted their German counterparts. They relied on rest periods for maintenance. The Canadians just kept coming, swapping engines in the field, ignoring regulations on track life, and driving there into the teeth of the enemy defenses. By the time the Canadian First Army began its push toward the M4 Sherman in their hands had ceased to be just a medium tank. It had become a weapon of psychological pressure. Germans looked at the technical specs of the Sherman and saw a target, but when they looked through their sights at a Canadian regiment, they saw a relentless swarm that simply did not care that it was outclassed. The tool was flawed, but the user was dangerous because he refused to let the machine's weakness become his own. Canadians were about to take this aggression a step further, modifying the very steel of the tank to match their lethal intent. June 7, 1944, day D+1, as the initial euphoria. The beach landings faded, Canadian armored regiments pushing inland near hit a wall of steel that no amount of pre-invasion optimism could breach. The 12th SS Panzer Division, commanded by fanatical veterans, deployed Panther and Tiger tanks that seemed impervious to the standard Allied arsenal. For a Canadian Sherman crew, turning a corner to face the frontal armor of a German heavy tank was essentially a death sentence. Standard 75 shell would simply shatter against the German plating, while the high-velocity German 88 more 75 rounds could punch through a Sherman like a hot knife through butter from 2 away. Mathematical certainty of defeat should have led to caution. Instead, it led to the Firefly. The Sherman Firefly was the British answer to the German heavy armor crisis, a desperate improvisation that involved jamming a massive 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the cramped turret of a standard M4. It was an engineering nightmare. The breech of the gun was so large it had to be turned sideways to load. The radio had to be moved to an armored box on the back of the turret, and the assistant driver's position was eliminated to store the massive ammunition. But to the Canadians, who received these hybrid monsters with open arms, the Firefly was the equalizer. While British doctrine initially prescribed deploying Fireflies in a defensive overwatch role, hanging back to snipe while the standard Shermans advanced, Canadian commanders frequently discarded the manual. They understood that in the dense and shattered villages of Normandy, long-range sightlines were rare. The kill zone was often less than 200 m. Consequently, Canadian crews integrated the Firefly directly into the tip of their armored spears. They treated this high-value asset not as a sniper but as a brawler with a sledgehammer. This tactical shift terrified the Germans. Tank commanders were trained to recognize the distinct silhouette of the Firefly. They called it out with frantic urgency over their radios, ordering all gunners to ignore standard Shermans and focus fire on the one with the long barrel. To counter this, Canadian crews adopted unhinged measures of deception. They painted the front half of the 17-pounder barrel with countershading white or sky blue paint to create the illusion of a standard short 75 gun from a distance. They welded false muzzle brakes onto the mantlet. This visual trickery forced German gunners to hesitate, unsure of which tank posed the mortal threat. That split second of hesitation was often the only window a Canadian gunner needed. Firing the Firefly was a violent, chaotic experience. The gun had no muzzle brake, initially massive enough to dampen the recoil fully, and when fired, it produced a blinding flash and a shock wave that kicked up dust, obscuring the target for seconds. The commander had to guide the gunner blindly for a follow-up shot, yet the psychological impact on the German crews was devastating. For years, Tiger crews had operated with a sense of invincibility, knowing they could sit outside Allied range and pick off targets with impunity. The Canadian Fireflies shattered this comfort zone. Suddenly, Sherman sitting in a wasn't just a nuisance. It was a lethal threat capable of ripping the turret off a Tiger from a kilometer away. The apex of this lethal capability occurred on August 8, 1944. During Operation Totalize, a troop of Fireflies from the regiment, a Canadian Armoured Unit, lay in ambush near. Rolling down the road was a counterattacking force led by none other than SS Michael, the most famous tank ace of the war. Commanding a Tiger 7, had decimated British armor at, and was a figure of mythical status in the German military. He moved with the arrogance of predator who believed he was apex. He did not see the Canadians. Gunner and a Firefly called waited with icy discipline. When the Tigers exposed their flanks, the Canadian Firefly roared. The 17-pounder shell, traveling at over 2,900 per second, didn't just penetrate, it annihilated. As Tiger exploded, the turret blown clear off the hull by the catastrophic detonation of its ammunition. In moments, the Canadians had decapitated the legend of the SS Panzer Corps. While historians debated for decades whether it was British or Canadian fire that claimed the kill, the effect on the ground was indisputable. The Canadians had proven that with the Firefly they weren't just participating in the battle, they were hunting the hunters. The destruction of this unit signaled a shift in the balance of terror. The Firefly allowed Canadian aggression to be backed by raw kinetic power. It emboldened the commanders to push harder, knowing that when the German heavy cats emerged from the tree lines, the Canadians didn't have to call for air support or retreat. They could stand their ground, leveled along snout, and punch a hole straight through the myth of Aryan armor supremacy. Equalizer had done its job, turning the Sherman from a victim into an executioner. Late August 1944, the dusty roads of the FZ Pocket, as the Canadian Army pushed out of Normandy and began the long pursuit toward Belgium and the Netherlands, a strange transformation overcame their vehicle columns. To a distant observer, the silhouettes moving through the haze no longer resembled the crisp factory standard machines that had rolled off the assembly lines in Detroit or Flint. They looked swollen, jagged, and feral. The Canadians had stopped waiting for better tanks to arrive from supply depots. Instead, they had decided to build their own protection using the of the battlefield. The logic of the Canadian tanker was brutally simple. The standard 51 mm frontal armor on an M4 Sherman was mathematically insufficient to stop a German high-velocity round. A Panther's 75 mm could punch through a Sherman's plate from ranges where the Canadian tank appeared as nothing more than a speck in the optics. The crews knew the statistics and they rejected them. Across the regiments, from the Governor General's Horse Guards to the South Alberta Regiment, a field modification craze took hold that bordered on an obsession. It started with track armor. Crews began scavenging spare track links, either from their own supplies from disabled vehicles or stripped from the carcasses of destroyed German panzers. In the nightly loggers, amidst the exhaustion of combat, the blue light of arc welders flickered like fireflies. Mechanics and crewmen worked feverishly, welding rows of heavy steel tracks across the front slope and turret sides of their Shermans. They covered the transmission housings, the turret cheeks, and even the hull sides. It was unauthorized, it added tons of weight, and it strained the suspension springs to their breaking point. But to the men inside, it was a layer of steel between them and a fiery death. But the unhinged nature of Canadian improvisation didn't stop at steel. It extended to masonry. In one of the most bizarre developments of the Western Front, Canadian workshops began acting as construction sites. Crews built wooden forms around the front of their tank hulls and poured wet concrete into them, often reinforcing the mix with rebar or rocks found in the rubble of French villages. When the forms were stripped away, the tank carried a thick gray slab of artificial stone on its chest. To the German observers peering through binoculars, these oncoming machines looked monstrous. They were no longer recognizable as standard Allied armor. They looked like moving bunkers rolling heaps of scrap metal and stone that groaned under their own weight. This visual impact was significant. The prided itself on precision, engineering, and clean lines. Their tanks were apex predators of design. Canadian tanks, conversely, looked like Mad Max creations born of desperation and rage. It signaled to the German defenders that they were fighting an enemy that had abandoned the rule book. Technically, these modifications were a nightmare for the logistical command. The extra weight destroyed transmissions and caused final drives to shear off with alarming frequency. The concrete offered dubious ballistic protection. Physics dictated that it might actually help a kinetic penetrator bite into the armor rather than deflect. Furthermore, American commanders like General famously banned such modifications in the Third Army, calling them cowardly and detrimental to the tank's speed. But in the Canadian sector, the concrete mentality prevailed. It wasn't just about the physics of deflection, it was about the psychology of aggression. Crew that felt safer was a crew that pushed forward, a driver who believed, rightly or wrongly, that the slab of concrete on his hull might stop an 80 shell was more likely to drive his tank out of the cover of the and charge a German position. The modifications acted as a placebo that unlocked the ferocious potential of the crew. This concrete mentality fundamentally altered the rhythm of battle. When a German anti-tank gunner fired at a standard Sherman, he expected a kill. When he fired at a Canadian concrete Sherman and saw sparks fly or the round shatter against a track link, panic set in. The Canadians didn't stop. They absorbed hits that should have terrified them and kept rolling, their engines screaming under the strain of the extra tonnage. German infantry nicknamed these modified beasts Frankensteins or simply dismissed the crews as barbaric. It seemed unfair, unsporting even to turn a tank into rolling fortress of scavenged junk, but for the Canadians fighting through the flooded boulders of the and the fortified towns of the Rhineland, fairness was a peacetime luxury. They turned the M4 Sherman into a reflection of their own war, ugly, improvised, grinding, and utterly relentless. They were willing to break the machine to break the enemy, sacrificing the engine for 5 more minutes of survival in the kill zone. And as the concrete-covered Shermans ground their way into Germany, the terrifying reality for the was that the Canadians didn't care how they looked or how much they weighed, only that they were still coming. February 8, 1945, the dark rain-soaked dawn of Operation Veritable, the forest stood as a formidable barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. The terrain was a nightmare of waterlogged fields and dense woodland, essentially negating the primary advantage of the armored division: mobility. A conventional commander might have held his tanks in reserve, waiting for dry ground to maneuver, but Lieutenant General Guy, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps, was not a conventional commander. He was a cold pragmatist who viewed as an industrial process, and he decided to utilize his Shermans in a way that every manual of armored warfare written to date. He turned his tanks into artillery. This tactic was known as the Pepperpot, and to the German defenders huddled in their bunkers on the freed line, it felt less like a battle and more like an execution by machinery. The concept was simple but unhinged in its scale. Every weapon system available to the Corps, not just field artillery, but anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft heavy machine guns, and crucially the main guns of the tank regiments, would be synchronized to fire simultaneously onto a single target sector. For the crews of the Canadian Grenadier Guards or the British Columbia Regiment, this meant parking their Shermans on reverse slopes, far out of sight of the enemy. The commanders popped their hatches not to scan for enemy tanks but to set clinometers and dial sights usually reserved for howitzers. They received firing coordinates from forward observers, adjusted their gun elevation to angles that looked absurdly high, and waited for the order. When the signal came, the result was a rate of fire that traditional artillery could never match. A standard artillery battery might fire 2 or 3 rounds a minute per gun. A well-drilled Sherman crew could pump out 10 to 12 rounds minute. When an entire regiment opened up, the volume of high-explosive shells descending on the German lines was cataclysmic. The M4 Sherman, designed to duel panzers at 800 wide, was now lobbing shells at targets 4 m away. The Germans on the receiving end could not comprehend what was hitting them. Veteran officers were accustomed to the rhythm of artillery, the boom of the gun, the flight time, the explosion. But the Pepperpot created a chaotic, continuous wall of noise and shrapnel. The high-velocity crack of 17-pounder rounds mixed with the thump of 75 shells and the buzzsaw of 20 anti-aircraft cannons firing horizontally. It was a cacophony of different calibers arriving at different velocities, making it impossible to time movements or find safety. The air simply became solid with metal. This tactical insanity came with a heavy cost to the machines, one that Canadian commanders accepted with a shrug. Tank guns were rifled to spin a shell for accuracy against armor. They were not designed for the sustained thermal stress of prolonged bombardment. After firing hundreds of rounds in a single morning, the rifling in the Sherman barrels would be stripped smooth, ruining the gun's accuracy for future tank-on-tank engagements. Recoil fluid would boil, the breaches would expand. In any other army, destroying the barrels of your primary battle tanks to shell infantry would be a court-martial offense. In the Canadian Army, it was standard operating procedure. The logistical consumption was equally staggering. The Pepperpot devoured ammunition trains. Supply trucks had to run 24-hour convoys just to feed the insatiable hunger of the Shermans. Empty brass casings piled up in mounds so high they blocked the escape hatches of the tanks, yet the effect was undeniable. When Canadian infantry finally advanced through the mud, they often found German positions that hadn't just been neutralized. They had been erased. Survivors were found in a state of catatonic shock, unable to speak, their will to fight pulverized by the sheer relentless weight of the fire. For the German High Command, this use of the Sherman was terrifying because it removed the quote-unquote lull from the battle. There was no pause. The Canadians did not need to wait for heavy artillery to move up. They brought their artillery with them in the form of the tank. They had taken a vehicle built for the cavalry charge and transformed it into a weapon of siege warfare. It reinforced the German view that the Canadians were not fighting a gentleman's war of maneuver but a brutal war of annihilation. The Sherman in their hands was no longer a duelist's saber. It was a bludgeon swinging blindly and repeatedly until nothing in front of it was left standing. The Pepperpot proved that for the Canadians there was no such thing as misuse of equipment, only underuse of firepower. August 7, 1944, the eve of Operation Totalize. The night air south of Caen was thick with the rumble of diesel engines and the smell of exhaust, but the column forming up in the darkness was unlike anything the war had seen before. At the head of the formation were the standard Sherman tanks, their engines idling, but behind them sat a bizarre collection of vehicles. That classification. They were M7 Priest self-propelled guns, but they had been gelled. Their 105 howitzers had been ripped out, the front welded shut with scrap steel, and the internal ammunition racks torched away to create a hollow armored cavern. Packed inside these metal shells were not artillery men but infantry soldiers of the Canadian Highlands, clutching Lee rifles and Bren guns, waiting for the signal to do the unthinkable, charge directly into the German anti-tank screen at night mounted inside a tank hole. This was the birth of the Kangaroo, and it represented the final evolution of the Canadian philosophy of total war. The concept was the brainchild of Lieutenant General Guy, who identified a fatal flaw in Allied offensive doctrine. For years, the standard procedure was for tanks to advance while infantry walked behind or rode in soft-skinned trucks that would stop miles from the front. As soon as German machine guns opened fire or mortar rounds began to fall, the infantry would be forced to ground, leaving the tanks to push on alone, blind and vulnerable to close quarters ambush. This separation of forces was exactly what the German defense relied on. Refused to accept this grim calculus. His solution was radical and, to the logistical purists, unhinged. He ordered the immediate cannibalization of operational artillery pieces. The workshop code name for the project was Kangaroo, referencing the pouch in which the infantry would be carried. In a matter of days, field workshops butchered dozens of valuable M7 priests, stripping them of their primary weaponry to convert them into improvised armored personnel carriers, APCs. Later, as the supply of priests ran dry, the Canadians turned to their stockpile of obsolete ram tanks, cutting the turrets off and gutting the interiors. To the German defenders of the 12th SS and the 89th Infantry Division, the arrival of the Kangaroos was a psychological shock that disrupted their entire defensive rhythm. German defensive doctrine was predicated on stripping the infantry away from the tanks. They would saturate the killing zone with shrapnel and mortar fire, knowing it would pin down the foot soldiers. But when the attack commenced on the road to Filesy, the shrapnel bounced harmlessly off the thick frontal armor of the Kangaroos. The Canadians didn't stop at the edge of the field. They drove the Kangaroos right through the defensive barges, crashing over and rolling directly onto the German trench lines. For soldier, the terror was absolute. He would see a tank approaching, firing its machine guns and prepare to take cover, but instead of passing by, the tank would stop directly over his foxhole, and suddenly 12 heavily armed Canadians would pour out of the top like a swarm of angry wasps, engaging in hand-to-hand combat inside the defensive perimeter. The Kangaroos allowed the Canadians to maintain a tempo of operations that was impossible for standard infantry divisions. They turned the battle into a fluid, high-speed, chaotic brawl where the front line moved at the speed of a tank engine, not a walking man. This was total war in its most mechanized form. The infantry were no longer separate from the machine. They were encased Within it, the conditions inside a Kangaroo were hellish. There were no seats, only a steel floor vibrating violently as the tracks chewed up the earth. The soldiers were packed shoulder to shoulder, inhaling fumes, dust, and the cordite smoke from the vehicle's defensive machine guns. If Kangaroo was hit by a high-velocity round, it became a steel coffin. But the infantry loved them. They loved them because they meant survival. They meant arriving at the objective fresh and ready to fight rather than exhausted and terrified from walking through a mile of open ground under fire. This improvisation marked a pivotal shift in how the Sherman and its variants were perceived. The Canadians had taken a medium tank. By the time the Canadian Army reached the Gap, the Kangaroo had become integral to their identity. They were the only army in the world capable of launching fully armored assaults where every single soldier from the tank commander to the was behind steel, to the Germans who were, by late 1944, relying on horses and bicycles to move their infantry. The sight of a Canadian column was a vision of a terrifyingly modern war. It was a war where the enemy didn't just have more tanks. They had turned their entire army into a relentless armored organism that refused to bleed where it was supposed to. The unhinged decision to decapitate tanks to carry men had changed the geometry of the battlefield forever. May 5, 1945. The Hotel dealed in Netherlands, as Colonel General, signed the capitulation of German forces in the Netherlands to Lieutenant General Charles Foch. The war in Europe was effectively over, yet in the debriefings and interrogations that followed, consistent theme emerged from the defeated officers. They spoke of the Americans with respect for their logistics and the British for their tenacity, but they spoke of the Canadians with a specific kind of professional dread. The M4 Sherman, under the command of the Canadian First Army, had transcended its design specifications. It was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol of a force that refused to accept the limitations of reality. The unhinged tactics, the suicidal Firefly ambushes, the concrete armor that physics, the relentless Pepperpot barges, and the Kangaroo charges had created a legacy that stripped the German of its psychological superiority. History often remembers the Sherman as a death trap or a weak link in the Allied arsenal, but the Canadian experience proves otherwise. In the hands of men who were willing to weld, cut, and improvise their way to victory, the Sherman was the perfect instrument of total war. It didn't to be the best tank on the battlefield, it just needed to be driven by the most determined crews. The legacy of the Canadian Sherman is not written in the technical manuals of 1944, but in the respectful fear of the enemy, who realized too late that the tank facing them wasn't fighting by the rules. The machine was ordinary, the men inside were anything but.